So welcome everybody to today's forum, Afghanistan, today's defeat of imperialism and tomorrow's defeat of the Taliban, hosted by Socialist Resurgence and the Boston Revolutionary Socialists. My name is Reed from the BRS. I'll be chairing this meeting today along with Regina from Socialist Resurgence. This is a collaboration rooted in the Revolutionary Socialist Network, of which both groups are affiliates. We're holding this meeting today the day after the 20th anniversary of 9/11, when thousands of people lost their lives. We are also holding this meeting weeks after the United States pulled out its troops from Afghanistan, ending a 2-decade-long occupation that has led to the deaths of over 175,000 people. Since the pullout of US troops, where is Afghanistan going? How are Afghanistan women and workers resisting the Taliban? And how can we build an effective movement here to stop the next US war?
So we are joined today by socialists who oppose the turn to war days after 9/11, peace activists who have seen the reality of war firsthand, and revolutionaries from the region who know intimately the fight against both the Taliban and US domination. I would also like to make a land acknowledgement. We are holding this meeting in the United States on indigenous land that was stolen and never ceded. Just as we stand for the freedom of Afghanistan from US dominations, we stand for the self-determination and freedom of indigenous people on this land. So each speaker will present for about 10 to 15 minutes, and we will open up discussion and comments and questions afterwards. So we are ready to introduce the first speaker. Kathy Kelly is a peace activist and author, made over 24 trips to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2019, living with young friends in a working class neighborhood in Kabul. So Kathy, go ahead.
Well, good morning, and Regina and Reed, thank you for helping to bring us together, and to all the organizers, my gratitude as well. And thank you to all who've taken time to join this morning. I guess I want to make a disclosure in a sense that I've tried throughout my life, my adult life, to be a pacifist, that the idea of picking up a weapon to kill a person because of which side of a border they might live on or which politician might have their hand in that person's pocket has always seemed something I shouldn't get involved in. So I've been a war tax refuser since 1980. I've tried very hard not to become involved in militarism, and I've gone to prison on some occasions for resisting United States weapons, and also have gone to various war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Gaza, in Lebanon, wanting to help people in the United States better understand the consequences of our wars. So I feel particularly kind of surprised and thankful that people in your networks would be willing to listen to something from the perspective that that has informed me. You know, I want to start by saying that the world came closer than ever before to stopping a war before it started. In the build-up to the war against Iraq, there were thousands, and then we saw millions of people out in the streets. And I know that it didn't succeed, and I know that had we perhaps had the valor of the people in the Arab Spring networks who stayed in the streets, who didn't, pack up and go home, maybe history would have gone differently. But I do think we should ask ourselves, how did people ever even know anything about what was going on in Iraq? It was not because the United States mainstream media helped inform people. It was because grassroots people took it upon themselves to question the US media, to send representatives over to Iraq. I helped organize 70 delegations, all in open and public violation of the economic sanctions against Iraq. We broke those sanctions, came back, and people hit the ground running. And they educated their communities about what was happening in Iraq and helped people begin to re-evaluate this idea of terrorists. Who are the terrorists? And that's the question we have needed to press all throughout these horrible wars. Who are the terrorists who is the main warlord in the world, and you look at the statistics of weapon sales and weapon manufacture and these hideous lobbies that have a vice-like grip on the US Congress, on US education in many ways, on so many communities across the United States, and they are peddling terror all around the world, while we're encouraged here in the United States to be afraid, be very afraid. And what could have represented that more than the 9/11 attacks so quickly being used to generate fear and to create a rationale, a justification for terrifying wars that have never let up. So what happened in Afghanistan in terms of the 75% of the people who are women and children in the country, and it's a very young country, in terms of any improvement of their lives during this long, long stretch of United States warfare and occupation. In my own experience, and I want to acknowledge, I don't speak the language fluently. I barely ever left a working class neighborhood in Kabul every time that I went to Afghanistan, but I did hear from people. And, you know, I remember going to refugee camps quite a few times and women just desperate for water and food. I remember being with widows who would get pushed all the way up the mountainside because that's where there was no water, so the rents were cheaper. And they'd say, well, of course we don't want our children to be child laborers, but how else can we get scraps of food into this family? And I remember young friends saying to me, tell your parents in your country not to send their soldiers here. It's very dangerous for them. And really, they aren't helping us. And meanwhile, throughout all of those years, in different kinds of reiterations, the US kept insisting that its military mission in Afghanistan was crucial to defend the women, to take care of the children. But all throughout, if you look at the statistics, Afghanistan has remained the worst place in the world into which a child can be born. And women continue to deal with their children coping with severe acute malnourishment, stunted growth. 1 in 3 young women in Afghanistan has severe anemia. You can't possibly say that the United States has improved the conditions in the country. And of course, now I think precisely because of the US support for corrupt systems, and militarism and corruption went hand in hand, and there are many reports that show that, we created the situation which made it possible for a Taliban takeover. So we, you know, Rabbi Abraham Heschel has said, some are guilty, but all are accountable. And I've lived well in a country whose economy is propped up by weapon manufacturing and weapon sales. I want to particularly point out Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, General Atomics. And now we see that they're not fazed by the idea of troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, possibly affecting their ability to get more money from the United States. Witness the sinister raising of money that will go into the military because of a recent congressional decision. They're not fazed. In fact, you know, President Biden has said, look, you know, I'm not for troops on the ground, but I favor combining special operations commandos, airstrikes, drone surveillance, and drone strikes and CIA activity. And that's how we can continue to meddle in the affairs and control the resources of other countries. Meanwhile, they'll use this freeing of forces dedicated to Afghanistan in the past to pivot toward China. So we still have a tremendous amount of work to do in educating people in the United States, never to be bamboozled by the idea that the United States military is a force for good. There's no such thing as a humanitarian war. That's a pernicious oxymoron. I do want to say that we may begin to hear that there have to be sanctions against Afghanistan in order to prevent the Taliban from gaining power. And already money assets are frozen, and Taliban are being hit financially. In my experience, whether it's been in Haiti, Afghanistan, Iraq, economic sanctions will clobber the poorest and most vulnerable people, the elderly people, the sick people. Look what's happened in Iran. And it isn't necessarily the case that the people up at the top will miss a meal. So I do not recommend economic sanctions or any presumption on the part of the United States that it has a right to control the development of what goes on in Afghanistan today. And I may sound contradictory, but I do strongly believe that the United States should be held accountable to reparations. And by reparations, I mean financial reparations, but also reparations that come through dismantling the military systems that have caused so much havoc and violence in the first place. So thank you very much for this time with you. I greatly look forward to responses of other people in this community that's gathered and to each of the other panelists' presentations.
Thank you so much, Kathy. What a wonderful beginning to our discussion. I'm now pleased to introduce Bill Keach, who is a member of the Tempest Collective and of the Boston Revolutionary Socialists. In the days after 9/11, he was one of the, many dozens and hundreds of people that were, out there speaking out against the attempt to turn tragedy into war after 9/11. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Bill Keach.
Thank you, Reed, and thanks, Kathy. I just want to begin by saying it's great to be having this conversation today with people like Kathy and Farouk, who have actually been in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and know immediately what the circumstances are like in the region. It's the first meeting of this kind that I've participated in where there's been that kind of direct input from people who know in an immediate sense what they're talking about. So glad you're both here, and also glad to be on the panel with Erwin. So the US withdrawal from Afghanistan has coincided with the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And I've been thinking that the understandable grief about this anniversary, combined with the predictable barrage of patriotic sentiment, both actually, in my opinion, obscure an essential focus on the reality of what happened. 2,996 people were killed on 9/11. 71,000 people have been killed in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. That's an average of 3,550 deaths a day, if you want to think of it numerically. So the most important question about the 9/11 attacks is the one most consistently avoided. Why did these attacks happen in the first place? There's going to be a special on CNN tonight called What Went Wrong in Afghanistan. My expectation is that there will be a lot of acknowledgement of certain kinds of failure, maybe even a few of certain kinds of defeat. But the key question of why organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban exist is hardly ever even asked, I believe. What are the historical and social and political conditions that led to the growth of violent, reactionary, fundamentalist Islamic nationalism, and that keep these kinds of political organizations in existence? There's an important reason why this question is suppressed or repressed. It leads inevitably to a recognition of the long-term consequences of US and NATO intervention in the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa, and other parts of the world. Now, to say this is not to deny the complications and differences among various violent Islamist formations, nor or the historical and cultural complexities of Afghanistan in particular, which are very considerable. It is to recognize that these formations wouldn't exist in their present forms if it weren't for US imperialist intervention and war, and for the capitalist priorities that underlie and drive them, even in the face of defeats like the one we're witnessing now. Let's think about the origins of the Taliban itself. The brief account I'll give here is indebted to Deepa Kumar's book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, a book I recommend if you're looking for something to read on this question. It was first published by Haymarket Books in 2012 and is just about to be reissued in a revised and updated version by Verso. Let's go back to the late 70s and 80s. First Jimmy Carter, then Ronald Reagan began to arm and train the Mujahideen, Islamic fighters resisting the Soviet Union's attempt to take over and control Afghanistan. The Mujahideen included militants from Afghanistan itself, but there were also large contingents of Arab militants from the Middle East. Many of the Mujahideen had been educated and trained in Pakistani schools or madrasas, and Farouk may be able to come back and elaborate on this factor if he wants to. A prominent figure among the Mujahideen at this time was a Saudi Arabian businessman named Osama bin Laden. By 1989, the Mujahideen, with US backing, had forced the Soviet Union to retreat. The Taliban, with the support of the Pakistani government and military, were mainly drawn from the Pashtun ethnic group in Afghanistan, fought to win control of the country, and by 1996 had captured Kabul. Ideologically, they are adherents of a reactionary version of Sunni Islam known as Deobundi, or the Deobundi movement, or current. Deobundi is the name of a city in northern India, where apparently this form of Sunni Islam originated. The US publicly criticized the Taliban for their intolerance, especially for their treatment of women. But secretly, the Clinton administration negotiated with the Taliban in the hope of building a pipeline to gain access to and control over oil and gas resources in the Caspian Sea. It was clear, and it still is, that the US government is perfectly willing to look the other way and work with violent reactionary groups like the Taliban when doing so is in the interest of US capital. Under Taliban rule, Afghanistan gradually became a haven for other violent Islamist groups originating in other countries, particularly Al-Qaeda. 15 of the hijackers who carried out the 9/11 attacks were from Saudi Arabia, a major US ally. And there's an article in the news today, I'm sure some of you've seen it, about a just issued FBI report on the involvement of the Saudi Arabian government in the 9/11 attacks. Apparently, this FBI report is inconclusive, but in the course of establishing its inconclusiveness, it presents a lot of new and very disturbing evidence. The US has shown itself quite willing to cooperate with and support groups like the Taliban until the US itself becomes a target of their violence. So why did the US become an immediate target? Why is it still? Two main points about this. First of all, who are the US's main allies in the Middle East? Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, Naftali Bennett, Benjamin Netanyahu's recent replacement in Israel, all responsible for violently repressive and corrupt rule in their own countries, and certainly in the case of Israel, especially outside their own national boundaries. All recipients of massive US aid and military support, all enemies of the secular movements for democracy from below that exploded during the Arab Spring of 2010 to 2012. Again, the US government produced a certain amount of doublespeak during the Arab Spring, long on superficial support, short on steps that would enable serious political transformation. Second main point, what was the US's so-called war on terror meant? What has the US's so-called war on terror meant for the lives of most ordinary people in the Middle East and Muslims elsewhere in the world? The Cost of War Project, which is based at Brown University, where I used to teach, estimates that the war on terror has cost 900,000 lives and $6 trillion in government spending over the last 20 years. I just saw, right before I got on this call, a new article in The Intercept that refers to $8 to $9 trillion in government spending. I guess when you get into that territory, it's hard to know what kind of estimate is even comprehensible. Many of these 900,000 lives lost were destroyed by the massive US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. But in recent years, some of these 900,000 lives have been destroyed in the new and now preferred US style of over-the-horizon warfare that Kathy mentioned in her comments. That is, remote and technologically advanced targeted attacks, such as drone strikes and special forces operations, like the one that assassinated Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, and that Obama and the Democrats are so proud and confident of promoting. And on this topic, as I'm sure you've all followed it, there's a significant and long special article in yesterday's Washington Post called "Examining a quote unquote righteous strike," that is about the actual evidence of why this car in Kabul was targeted, and the conclusion it comes to is that there's no real evidence that the car contained explosives, and it's the old story about initially about collateral casualties, and now about the occasional accidents that just happen to kill 10 innocent Afghan people. This is what US drone strikes and their touted avoidance of killing innocent people really mean. Groups such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS thrive off the military violence the US deploys in the name, as Biden likes to say, of making sure there are no more attacks on the US homeland. The war on terror is itself a prolonged and ongoing project of inflicting terror on Islamic people around the world. Kathy made this point really well in her remarks. A project driven ultimately by capitalist determination to control the world's oil and gas supplies and profits, and just as important, a determination to maintain and extend US global financial and strategic supremacy. The limits of US supremacy have been made clear in Afghanistan, as they have been in Iraq, as they were in Vietnam. But nothing short of a mass anti-imperialist, anti-war movement can prevent the US and its allies from trying again and again. As Kathy also said, a huge worldwide anti-war current developed in the months leading up to and just after the US's 2003 invasion of Iraq. On February the 15th, 2003, an estimated 17 million protesters filled the streets of New York, Rome, Paris, London, and other cities around the world. But the movement couldn't be sustained. The lingering effects of the 9/11 attacks, together with the Bush administration's lies about Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction, gradually eroded confidence and the participation of many in the movement. The election of Barack Obama also took a toll. Obama had campaigned against continuing the war in Iraq and promised to wind down the war in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, many anti-war protesters believed him. We're now still living with the results. The current catastrophe in Afghanistan presents an opportunity for the socialist left to help re-energize a mass anti-war movement independent of the Democrats. We are the ones who need to be answering the question, what went wrong in Afghanistan, by saying that the war in Afghanistan was a disaster from the beginning, an imperialist war that was never seriously about the needs of a majority of the Afghan people. We have to be the ones insisting that the future of Afghanistan can only be decided by the Afghans themselves, a vast majority of whom don't want to be ruled by the Taliban or by a corrupt puppet government designed to serve US and NATO ruling class interests. I'll leave it there for now and really look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Our next speaker is Farouk Tariq. He's a member of Hukuk Khalq, which is also the Hukuk Khalq movement, which is the People's Rights Movement of Pakistan. So go ahead, Farouk.
You're muted. Farouk, you're muted.
Sorry.
There's good.
Thank you, Kathy and Bill, for giving some history and some background, and particularly Bill, you gave all the details of what happened and how American imperialism has treated Afghanistan in the past 20 years. I will take up issue of Pakistan, impact on Pakistan, issue of religious fundamentalism, what happened and what are our demands, which Kathy has spoken in the end to some extent. So I will take some of these points. Pakistani government has glorified the victory of Taliban, and now they are facilitating all the heads of intelligence agencies. Yesterday, 7 of them met in Islamabad, and they are now forming an opinion that we should engage with Taliban. And their main emphasis at this time is don't leave Afghanistan alone. But what they mean is recognize Taliban as a representative government of Afghanistan and support Taliban. Now, that is the position of the Pakistani government, and we can say that we don't agree with this position, what the government is now saying. I will speak about it, but it has great impact in Pakistan. Religious fundamentalism in Pakistan has been promoted, not only in Pakistan, but also in India, in most of the South Asian countries. And we see more incidents of glorifying Taliban, and also general acceptance among the Pakistani masses that it's good that Taliban has taken over, because they have just given their religious face. And most of the Pakistani people at this time has forgotten what happened during 96 to 2001, when Taliban were in power at the time. When TV was banned, when universities, women education was banned, when they broke all the cassettes and football was un-Islamic and all that different activities they did at the time, and you must have the beard and all that. But now there was a survey yesterday that over 55% of Pakistanis has approved the taking over of Taliban in Afghanistan. So that is a very complex matter. It's not very straightforward a support to Taliban, but it has also linked the consciousness of the people against American imperialism. People are happy that Americans are defeated. That is the main thing which people bring to their mind. I can tell you, when 9th place, my father called me to my hometown and he said, I am sick, you should come and visit me. So I went to Toba Tek Singh, my hometown, but he was not sick. He said, I am very happy that something has been done in America. I said, my father, you will see now the reaction of American imperialism. They will make the lives of Muslims all over the world terrible, and you will see the reaction of the barbarian American imperialist actions in the future, and we saw that. So, I mean, any action against American imperialism in the shape of individual terrorism or in the shape of taking over of Taliban is generally been accepted by the ordinary Muslims. But that's where we are fighting an ideological war within Pakistan, where we are not in majority, but we are saying that Taliban is a bad news. Taliban's taking over is a bad news for all the progressive forces. Yes, it is a defeat of American imperialism, but it is also a defeat of the progressive forces internationally, because now Taliban has taken over, which are one of the most conservative religious fundamentalist government. And we do not believe the words of Taliban who are saying we are not the old ones. And we have already seen the way they have behaved with the courageous demonstration of women in Kabul, the way they have treated them by beating them, by arresting them, the way they have behaved with the journalists. And we are printing a daily Urdu paper online called Jidojahad, The Struggle, in which we are printing Kabul diaries daily. We have a correspondent and we have friends in Kabul who are sending us what's happening every day in Kabul, and we see a total apathy. So what happened? Why Taliban were able to take over while over $2 trillion were spent by the Americans with the 300,000 fully armed army, and without a fight, they just went out. I think there was a general hatredness against Americans after 2005. After Iraq takeover, initially there was some illusions in Afghanistan that Americans would save them. But after 2005, we have many reports that Americans were not accepted. They should have left immediately afterwards, but they stayed on and on. And that has given an image to the ordinary Afghans that is good for the rich people, that Americans are giving money, but it's bad for the ordinary people. So there was a great polarization between rich and the poor because of the American aid in Afghanistan, and the way they have behaved, and the way the money was spent by some of the NGOs, some of the government officials, and some of the fake soldiers, ghost soldiers by these military journals. I mean, people would not fight for Americans. Why they should fight for the agents of Americans in the shape of Ashraf Ghani? So they just refuse to resist. And I think the whole structure went beyond their expectations into a collapse, total collapse. And I think it has taken by surprise, not only to American imperialism, but many more governments. They did not imagine that Taliban would be so fast to take over. They thought there will be some time, but it seems now that Doha negotiation paved the way for a distrust on the Ashraf Ghani government, because it was over the head of Ashraf Ghani. Trump went straight to Taliban to talk to them instead of involving their own agents, and they forced Pakistan to release Mullah Brother. They forced Ashraf Ghani to release 5,000 Taliban. And the image was given that Taliban is a force that cannot be conquered. So Americans have to deal with them, to talk to them. And I think Doha negotiation paved the way for the fastest occupation of Afghanistan, because there was absolute no trust on the Ashraf Ghani government, even by the American imperialism. Khalilzadeh played the main part, who was the American representative. And Trump was idiot enough to go and started these negotiations without consulting the Afghan government. They were not in favor. So, I mean, now they have taken over. What to do now? I think that Taliban should never be accepted as a genuine representative government of Afghanistan. It is a bunch of gangsters, terrorists who have taken over by force. They are not popular. Not a single demonstration took place in whole Afghanistan welcoming Taliban's government, while immediately women went out against the Taliban. So that shows that Talibans were not a popular force. There is also an image that they are popular in the villages, in the peasantry. No, peasantry was the worst affected by Taliban taking over of different parts of Afghanistan. You go with a gun to a village and say, you give us money for a motorbike, or you give one of your son to be recruited for Taliban. So when you have a gun in a village, what could villagers do there? They have to obey the orders of these terrorists. And that's what happened. And villages was the most poor area. And they don't drive the force, drive the sport from the villages. They recruited there through the gun by force. And in that sense, it's not a popular democratic takeover of Afghanistan. It's not a popular revolution. It is a bunch of gunmen, terrorists who have taken over. But on the other side, I know many of my friends in Afghanistan has not been paid for the last 3 months. And all the projects of World Bank and IMF and other institutions, they have just stopped paying. Not a single notice has been given to the employees. I know one organization, they lost 2,500 employees. They were working for peace within Afghanistan, and they lost all that wages. People are without food now. There is a real danger of hunger, which is facing to the Afghan people. So what I would say, Kathy, support the people's organization inside Afghanistan, support the groups inside Afghanistan, give them directly money, find the ways how to support them rather than going through Taliban, which would really give them some time to stay in power. And I would also say Taliban are not going to go away in immediate future. It's very difficult option. They have taken over. It will take some time. It's not like Iranian Revolution, which was a popular revolution against Shah. It is more of a gunfight. In that sense, it can stay for some more time because there is no sort of alternative to Taliban at present time. But that does not mean that there will be no resistance. For 20 years, women have seen employment and they will fight. They are the vanguard of the Afghan people's resistance at present time. And this is really a red salute to the courageous Afghan women who have seen in the eyes of Taliban and say, you go away, we want azadi, we want freedom. And that's where we are supporting them. We also say that there should be no restriction on people leaving Afghanistan, and Pakistan should not deport any Afghan refugees from here. They should give them all sort of assistance and they should be readjusted. And so that sort of maybe alternative program we have to see and formulate. It's a very complex situation. There is no real direct sort of solution of the situation, to be more flexible in our approaches, but I would never ever accept Taliban as the legitimate representative of Afghan people. Thank you.
Farouk, thank you so much for providing that much needed analysis. And it's also really grateful to hear some of the work that you're doing through the Struggle newspaper. If you could provide a link to that in the chat, that would be amazing. I'm sure everyone would love to check that out. And you know, whether it's we can Google Translate it or not, that would be awesome. So next, and to sort of close the panel before we open it up to questions, we have Erwin Fried, who's a Socialist Resurgence staff writer and organizer. So Erwin, you have the responsibility of tying everything together. So good luck. So thanks, everybody.
So thanks, Reed. Thanks, Farouk, Bill, Kathy, Regina, everybody that's attending today. Really appreciate everybody on who's watching on Facebook Live. It's really wonderful to be here with you all and have this discussion about what it means that the U.S. Was defeated and the U.S. military had to at least withdraw its overt operations in Afghanistan, and what that means for working people around the world. The rapid evacuation of coalition troops and tens of thousands of their Afghan collaborators shows that the United States is no longer able to rule the entire world through economic and military force alone. This defeat comes in the context of massive struggles by working people all over the world. Regionally, some of the largest mobilizations in history have taken place in recent years. multiple strikes of tens of millions of workers and farmers in India against the reactionary Modi regime, massive student mobilizations and peasant assemblies in Pakistan, uprisings for self-determination and against Chinese imperialism in Balochistan, a 3-year ongoing strike wave in Iran, which has recently brought in workers in the oil fields, which was the key sector in the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s and 80s, demonstrations of hundreds against U.S. occupation in Iraq, historic mobilizations in Lebanon that brought down the former government. These are all just a few of the major struggles we can look to help understand the world situation leading to the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan. Even working and oppressed people in the hearts of world imperialism are rising up. The mass movement calling for Black liberation that exploded in 2020 showed that the ruling class is losing its grip of control, not just everywhere, but also in the so-called homelands. We can celebrate the damage that the failure to successfully occupy Afghanistan has laid to U.S. imperialism. Since its inception, capitalism in the United States has used occupation, domination, and theft of land, resources, and labor to a vanishingly small ruling class. Over the last 30 years, the Yankee capitalists have taken it on themselves to project power and military control in the world. These considerations were the basic justification for invading Afghanistan and Iraq. Actually, the plan was to directly occupy not only Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the whole so-called axis of evil, including North Korea, Libya, Iran, and Syria. The failure of imperialism in Afghanistan is by extension also an opening for struggle in all of these countries by workers and farmers against their own ruling classes, without having to deal also with the devastation of U.S. occupation. It shows that despite endless imperialist propaganda and even the sentiments of some people on the left, U.S. imperialism is not invincible. The Taliban becoming the ruling group in Afghanistan also shows that to really achieve national liberation and self-determination, it is going to take more than just military struggle against occupation. The rise of the Taliban as the head of the new government is a roadblock to real liberation for working people, farmers, and oppressed populations in Afghanistan. Before I talk about the Taliban, which I really appreciate all of the contributions from my fellow panelists about, I want to give some background on what the U.S. has done in Afghanistan and its neighbors. Basically, U.S. imperialism followed in the footsteps of longstanding European colonialist policy by allying with the reactionary and violent religious extremists against relatively progressive and secular parties. In Afghanistan, this famously meant working with the Pakistani government to fund and arm the most aggressive mujahideen groups before, during, and after the Soviet occupation in the 70s and 80s. It was from these forces that the leaders of both the Taliban and the Afghanistan Republic would emerge. I think it's also worth noting that this was in the late 70s. This was also just shortly after the brutal war in what was East Pakistan and now Bangladesh, which Bangladeshis consider a genocidal war, which was carried out by what became the Pakistan government. The government that the United States set up, the Afghanistan Republic, was composed of thugs and warlords that the U.S. ruling class saw as most likely to comply with their decisions about what Afghanistan should do. It was incredibly unpopular and seen as part of the campaign of constant bombings, aerial assaults, and harassments being carried out by foreign occupiers. Parsing out the political differences between the Afghanistan Republic and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban's government, with regards to women's rights, multiculturalism, and democratic freedoms is not so simple. Equally importantly to the character of the so-called central authority was the fact that internal divisions within the country, whether based on geography, community affiliation, religion, similar things, were made more intense by competing foreign interests, funding, and allying with different actors across the country, often on temporary and shifting basis. The state of turmoil in the region that is so often portrayed in the media from the U.S. ruling class is a product of the situation created by that same class, which I think Kathy has spoken to pretty effectively. As my fellow panelists have ably spoken to, the U.S.-led occupation of Afghanistan was fundamentally characterized by its brutality, inhumanity, and utter levels of destruction. Even the investment into the country by imperialist and regional powers has been used to increase their own political foothold in Afghanistan and the region. The war in Afghanistan was a war on the people for the benefit of competing global and regional powers, most especially between and from the United States, India, Iran, Pakistan, Russia, China, and the Gulf states. After well over 200,000 people have died as a result of the US and NATO-led occupation, the situation is now one of imperialist vultures circling to be the ones to claim the spoils of war, with the Taliban now positioned to gain as the middlemen between the different external forces. The Taliban maintained itself in this situation as fighters against the US-backed republic, if not always the occupation itself. In general, they understood themselves to be unable to militarily defeat the US and did not provide a meaningful political alternative to the Karzai-Ghani regime. They were able to use sentiment against the occupation to recruit, but like the US military itself, a major source of enlistment came more from economic necessity and, as Farouk described, coercion than ideological motivation. We must understand this to see that while the Taliban as a group is fundamentally reactionary, the young men who join it some of the young men who join it will be able to be won over to a real social program for national liberation and socialism. Part of the task for revolutionaries in the coming period will be to develop an organization capable of winning the best elements of the working, farming, and young populations in Afghanistan to such a program. That is the key to ending Taliban rule. Ultimately, the Taliban leadership has been backed for the whole period of its existence by the Pakistani government, and more recently by Russia and Iran. These figures have been able to secure a place for themselves as the local mediators for the imperialist plunder of Afghanistan. It is worth keeping in mind that even the leadership of the Taliban is not unified. They have had constant internal squabbles over who should be the head of the group, and each has their own relationship with different international capitals. Echoing their first government between 1996 to the US invasion in 2001, the Taliban has begun to roll back women's rights and crack down on potential forces of opposition. An important part of US imperial decline is the growing separation between the ruling class's desire and the willingness of working people to carry out expansive military operations. In the first place, there is a really general sentiment against war among the US population. This has been an ongoing and severe crisis in the U.S. military. Despite the $1 trillion annual budget, recruitment has remained at low levels during the entire period of occupation in Afghanistan and Iraq. Recruitment levels are so low that the ruling class and their generals have had to resort to all sorts of different schemes to maintain their military reinforcement of economic and political control in the semi-colonial world. This has included massive deployments of National Guards members, the largest since the war in Korea, redeploying and extending deployments of troops on the ground past operational protocols, which really just destroys people mentally and physically, and famously filling in the gaps with private mercenaries paid incredible sums of money to kill, maim, and terrorize all over the globe. Another component of this is well-known drone programs, which were greatly expanded under the Obama administration. All these measures receive bipartisan support from the two major capitalist parties, who both attempt to expose the other as not being militaristic enough. A good example is the Democrats' multiple attempts to reinstate the draft during Bush's presidency, claiming that the Republican administration did not have what it takes to really win the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Veterans of these occupations are an essential group that can and will be won over the revolutionary struggle in the United States. Many joined as young workers, looking for a chance to have a future and to do some good in the world. It is well known that the military disproportionately recruits Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. No one knows the great lies of imperialism better than the people who have been on the front lines in its struggle to control by force entire countries. Millions of young people genuinely believe that they will help spread democracy and human rights, only to realize that the only thing that the United States is interested in is keeping the world safe for investments. A not insignificant number of rank-and-file troops quickly realize that they have more in common with the young people they interact with every day than they do the capitalists and politicians who sent them to war. That crushing realization manifests in statistics tracking suicide, drug addiction, and other measures of social alienation among veterans. It also manifests in an increasing number of veterans joining socialist groups and becoming active in movements for social justice and against their country's wars. So what does this mean? the possibilities for Afghan liberation today. In the first place, the end of occupation can provide real relief for the Afghan masses. The end of US-backed bombings is a major victory for Afghanistan and the whole world working class. And it remains, as was shown right after the US started to pull out of Afghanistan and justified a drone attack by saying it was going after ISIS, it remains to be that we in the United States need to continue to mobilize to make sure that there's a real end to bombings and other military actions in Afghanistan and everywhere. Already, the modest but important demonstrations of women against draconian measures being taken by the Taliban are shown that there is an energy for mobilization to be unleashed. The question is connecting the struggle in Afghanistan with that of the regional working, farming, and oppressed masses. In order to connect the struggles, it is necessary to deepen our efforts in building a party of revolution who can combine experiences, methods, analysis, and resources to connect anti-imperialist upsurge to the program of social revolution. As the dust settles from the 20-year occupation by the United States and NATO and the reactionary push against the Arab Spring uprisings, it is clear that the conditions that led to the upsurges remain and, if anything, are more generalized. Imperialism is weaker and more fragmented than even 10 years ago. Millions of people now have gone through concrete struggles and mobilizations against imperialism and for better working and living conditions. The climate crisis is becoming more real every day. Capitalism cannot solve any of these problems. I'm happy to be on a panel with my comrade Farouk, who is devoted to really building the struggle for self-determination against fundamentalism and against capitalism that will ultimately be decisive for working people to really win the class war in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and everywhere else. In the United States, we have the unending duty to resolutely oppose all military adventures carried out by our government. The ruling class in this country will take any opportunity to continue overt and covert aggression in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and wherever it deems strategically necessary. Socialist resurgence is fundamentally for abolishing the U.S. military apparatus, including its domestic operations, and using its $1 trillion-plus budget to give first of all give reparations to its victims, and secondly fund massive programs for immediate conversion to 100% renewables, quality housing, and education for all, and ending the for-profit death spiral in healthcare. We also call for open borders and ending the deportation machine to accept all displaced working people with full economic and political rights for good. In our view, what is desperately needed in the United States is the same as in Afghanistan and everywhere else. A fighting party of working people, farmers, and oppressed groups with a program capable of leading the movements to overthrow capitalism and imperialism for all time. Socialist Resurgence and our partners in the Revolutionary Socialist Network are part of building such an organization like this every day. And we hope that you will join us in our struggle. Thanks. Thanks again to all the panelists and participants.
Thank you so much, Erwin. And with that, the panel is concluded, and we're about to start the Q&A.